absolute juggernaut within the tabletop role-playing industry is making a profit-motivated decision which is going to negatively affect all the other smaller players within that industry and also the people who play the games. Companies that make kind of like antisocial decisions like this usually rely on the fact that we can't do much about those decisions, so we can't really push back. So the only choice we have is just to accept and move on. That isn't what's happening this time because consumers and creators have a lot more leverage than usual. And the reasons why they have more leverage than usual are, I think, fascinating. So even if you're not like a huge tabletop role-playing game fan, even if you don't normally like to hear analysis of business decisions, I think there might be something here for you in this video. If you are interested in left-wing politics, if you're interested in how a community relates to art, relates to creating art and its ownership, stick around. Regardless of how well or how little you know about tabletop role-playing games, the game that comes to mind when you think of tabletop role-playing games is almost certainly Dungeons & Dragons. Dungeons & Dragons was maybe the first tabletop role-playing game as we know it. There were some precursors, but in its modern form, Dungeons & Dragons was the first. In 1997, D&D was acquired by Wizards of the Coast, which was then acquired by game company Hasbro in 1999. You may know them as like the publishers of Monopoly. So Dungeons & Dragons is this huge, iconic, culturally important name, but that is kind of a relative statement. TTRPGs as an industry are tiny, tiny, tiny. Like, if you want to compare video games to TTRPGs, a video game is a battleship and TTRPGs are a rowboat. Dungeons & Dragons is just one property that Hasbro owns, and it owns a lot of properties. Like, it owns Magic the Gathering, it owns many, many board games, and in Hasbro's opinion, Dungeons & Dragons is a little bit under-monetized. Like, they're not making as much money as they think the brand could make. In the wake of these rumblings that Hasbro would like Wizards of the Coast to more fully take advantage of the monetization possibilities of Dungeons & Dragons, there has been a leak. This leak has gone out to multiple journalists, it's come from multiple sources, so I feel comfortable discussing it. The leak says that Wizards of the Coast will be updating the open game license from version 1.0 to version 1.1, and it includes the full text of what will be changing. And ever since this news dropped, the entire tabletop games industry has been on fire. Now, if you don't know anything about the game industry and are confused about why, first of all, bless you for staying with this video so long, but you might be confused about some terms, like, what the hell is the Open Games License? Had to write this part down, and I'm going to read it off because this is a little bit complicated. The Open Game License 1.0 permits third parties, that is, individuals and companies, to make limited use of Dungeons & Dragons related copyrights and trademarks for both commercial and non-commercial use. Anyone who participates in this retains ownership of what they create, but they must share and share alike. That is, they need to let other third parties make supplements for what they create. They can't just wall it off and say, this is mine now and you can't play with it. This has been really great for Wizards of the Coast. Like, there's, for example, a Lord of the Rings game that wouldn't exist otherwise. So if Lucasfilm or the Tolkien estate decide that there's a market for a tabletop RPG set in Middle-earth or set in the Star Wars galaxy, they can release a game using D&D mechanics. They can just use the most popular system in the world, one that a lot of gamers already know. That is incredibly convenient for them. It's also a huge win for Wizards of the Coast, because if there are new gamers who are lured in by wanting to play Han Solo, wanting to play Legolas, those gamers learn D&D as a system and are more likely to buy their products. It's a huge win-win arrangement for them. And those two examples are just like the biggest names in all of media. There are smaller companies who make use of the Open Games license. For instance, Paizo is a relatively smaller games company that releases a system called Pathfinder that was originally heavily based on D&D 3.5. That participates in OGL 1.0. There's a game from Pugsteady called Pugmire, which is distributed through Onyx Path Publishing. They use D&D 5th edition. And I could give like a dozen other examples. The point being, this is really, really common. That's not even getting into the thousands of modules, adventures, and supplements being released by everyone from large companies all the way down to self-published individuals for D&D. And Wizards of the Coast does not directly own that content and does not directly profit from it. And Wizards of the Coast now appears to see that as a problem. There are a lot of changes between OGL 1.0 and OGL 1.1, but I'm going to focus on 3 of them. The first big change is that Wizards of the Coast wants a lot more control. Instead of just disclosing that you're using the OGL, you would have to go to them and tell them, hey, I want to use the OGL. At which point they would give you a badge giving you permission to use D&D trademarks and copyrights, again, in a limited capacity. You would also have to tell them how much money you've made. I want you to put yourself in the mind of a guy who runs a D&D campaign like once a week and came up with a really good idea for a campaign. So he writes it up, he self-publishes it, and now for the rest of his life has to report like once a year to Wizards of the Coast that he made $15 off of it this year. What? Like, I used to be a financial analyst, so I understand the sort of executive brained thing that is happening here. They would love, for business decision purposes, to know how much economic activity out there in the world that they aren't taking advantage of is being generated by their product. So having people report that information to them or else lose, access to the OGL license, that, they would love to be able to demand that you tell them that information. It's very useful information. And it's also just this onerous burden to place on so many people when okay, we've got 2 more decisions. They get worse. The second change is that if a D&D OGL product makes more than $750,000, then for every dollar above $750,000, you have to hand over a quarter of that to Wizards of the Coast. This does not mean that if you make $750,000 that you suddenly owe Wizards of the Coast $187,500. It means that if you make $750,001, you owe Wizards of the Coast 25 cents. So it doesn't matter, it's math. To me, this is almost the most normal request. I mean, it's not going to be a welcome change, but it's the one that sort of makes normal human sense. The third change, the third change is wild. It says that if you make anything using the OGL, Wizards of the Coast can now use it for themselves. For example, if you make a class and release it as content, they can say, we really like this class. We think it'll make a lot of money for us. And we're going to use the entire text of what you wrote unchanged. And we own that now. Maybe this doesn't sound that wild to you because a lot of the time people kind of undervalue like the creative work of people who are just kind of fucking around in their basement. But to give you an idea of how just absolutely weird this is, imagine as Wizards of the Coast going to the Tolkien estate. Imagine the Tolkien estate released a character sheet of Legolas from Lord of the Rings and, you know, class stuff related to Legolas and all that. And they say, I really like that. And we really think that we would make a lot of money if Legolas were in the core D&D book. So Legolas is ours now. We own him. Like, and it's like, you understand why they went there, because, yeah, it would make them a lot of money if they could just decide that, you know, a really good piece of homebrew was theirs now, or that you know, Han Solo's character sheet from the Star Wars game is theirs now. Like, they would make a lot of money if they owned Han Solo. There's a good business case for owning Han Solo. But like you could kind of see how interpersonally it's and maybe even legally it's not going to go down that well. There's actually kind of a precedent for this in video games. Back in 2003, Blizzard released a little game called Warcraft 3. And eventually there was a mod for Warcraft 3 called Defense of the Ancients. And Defense of the Ancients, of course, as a mod, you know, used the engine for Warcraft 3, but mechanically it was almost completely distinct from Warcraft 3. And eventually the developers of the mod decided to spin it off into its own thing, to get their own engine, release it as a full game. And Blizzard looked at that and how they were going to make no money off of this new spun off game. And they said, shit, we left money on the table there. So they changed the terms and conditions for being able to mod their games to say, by the way, any mod you make for us is ours. We get to use it. We get to use the mechanics. We get to use the assets that you uploaded. Those are ours now. And what happened wasn't that there was another Defense of the Ancients that they got to, you know, take and publish without paying somebody. What happened was that modders stopped making mods. And there were some other knock-on effects as well. Like, a lot of people learn how to make video games by making mods. The fact that there was a whole community around making mods, around teaching each other how to get better at making mods, meant that there was this weird sort of like artist community that elevated really talented people up into becoming professional games programmers, you know, even if they eventually went on to their own projects instead of working for Blizzard or whoever they originally made the mod for. The moment that Blizzard said, no, we own that mod that you made, the community around making mods for Blizzard died. It just completely dried up. And I think it's interesting that that happened because it's not like modders made money. So it's not about the money. Like, for the most part, modders for computer games didn't make money. And for the most part, smaller, you know, self-published individuals making modules for D&D, they're not going to see like more than $50. Let's be honest. It has to be about the relationship. It has to be what it says Hasbro and Wizards of the Coast think about you. Their relationship to you. That they would say, you made this and I own it. At this point, I think there are going to be some people who say, look, I get it. These decisions are maybe unwise, might annoy a bunch of people, might not be the best thing for the wider community. But at the end of the day, Wizards of the Coast owns D&D. This is their playground. They set the rules. And we can disagree with them, but they own the space. It is their absolute right to set those rules. There's just not much you can do about it. And if that's your reaction based on everything I've told you, that's completely rational. But there is one thing I haven't told you. One minor detail that changes everything. You can't copyright game mechanics. What do I mean by that? You can't copyright having a game where there are players going on an adventure, going dungeon crawling. You can't copyright that they have statistics and hit points and derived values from their statistics, like modifiers. You can't copyright rolling a 20-sided die. You can't even copyright placing all of these things in a particular order and relationship to one another. Although you can, copyright what they're named. For another example, this is a beholder. It belongs to Wizards of the Coast. They will own the copyright on it until, sometime long after I'm dead. But this is an eyeball floater monster psychic thing I just made up. And it is fully legally distinct, and I own it. And there's nothing Wizards of the Coast can do about it. One of the funniest things about not being able to copyright mechanics is there is actually an example I can give you that I mentioned earlier in the video. Hasbro owns the game Monopoly. In roughly 1903, a woman named Elizabeth Maggie invented a game called the Landlord's Game and patented it. And she tried to sell it to a couple of board game companies who thought it was a little bit complicated. Meanwhile, she showed it to a bunch of people, and one of the people she showed it to made some very minor changes and then sold it to Parker Brothers. Luckily, Maggie had filed for a patent because she'd innovated a few things about board games themselves, like the mechanical layout of a board game. But D&D didn't do anything like that. It doesn't have a new technology that it can patent, right? So there's just nothing mechanically copyrightable about it. You can really only copyright names and the exact wording of some text. But aside from that, there's not much they can do if somebody decides to make a system that is functionally identical to play as Dungeons and Dragons, but with some different packaging around it. In that context, the context of not being able to copyright game mechanics themselves, the open game license as it originally existed looks a little bit different. The most valuable thing they own is more like trademarks than copyright. What they call specific things, like calling something Dungeons and Dragons, or calling this a beholder, or calling that stat charisma, stuff like that. That's what they own that is really valuable. And that sucks for them because copyright doesn't need to be defended in court. You own copyright whether or not you pursue it in court for a period of time. And if somebody infringes on your copyright, you can just collect the revenue and you retain the copyright. Trademark has to be actively defended or you lose it. Companies like Google or Kleenex or Photoshop have to be really careful not to let those words mean to search something on the internet, a bath tissue, or to edit photos. Because if that happens and they didn't defend against the trademark infringement, that is it. They lose the trademark. So D&D has to be really careful not to let Dungeons and Dragons become synonymous with a tabletop role-playing game. They were in a weird position where anybody could make a game that was functionally identical to Dungeons and Dragons, and what they would have to go after would be like trademarks like Beholder or calling the game Dungeons and Dragons. And that's not a great position to be in. So something like the open game license is actually protective of them. It means that they have given explicit permission to use the trademark under specific circumstances, and therefore they don't have to go sue people in order to maintain that trademark. It was not just out of the goodness of their heart, if you see what I mean. And now, with these changes to the open game license, it's hard to see how they're going to as effectively defend their trademarks without being a little bit more litigious. So all of these changes are like a little bit antisocial, right? Like they're heavily implying that they're going to be a little bit more litigious. They want you to do a lot more work in terms of like telling them what you're doing, telling them about your money situation, which is a lot if you're a smaller studio or an individual creator. Given that some developers, some companies are going to be wary about working with Wizards of the Coast, given these changes that look like they might be a little bit hostile to the community, and given that you can't copyright game mechanics, what's to prevent anybody from like making their own D&D with blackjack and hookers? And the answer is nothing, and it's already happening. Remember I mentioned Paizo and Pathfinder, that game that originally was heavily based on D&D 3.5? For a number of years, they have been moving away from using any copyrighted or trademarked material from D&D. They've still participated in the Open Games license, but it's because they wanted the benefits of it. They wanted third parties to be able to use the Open Games license to make modules and material for them. So what they've decided to do is work in conjunction with a number of other game companies to write up the system they have as they know it, transfer the copyrights and trademarks related to that system to a third party, like a nonprofit or something, and create their own open OGL, in this case called the Open RPG Creative License. I'm sure there's more coming like this. Like maybe not all of them are gonna try and release it as like an open license, but I promise you, many companies right now are looking to create a system that uses a 20-sided die and is legally distinct, but very similar to Dungeons and Dragons, because at the end of the day, what has happened isn't just like a series of business decisions. These are relationship decisions. These are decisions about, do we want to work with Wizards of the Coast given that they're doing these kind of business shark-like moves? I don't think this is going the way Wizards of the Coast and especially Hasbro thought it would. I don't think they anticipated the extent of this backlash. Is this going to inevitably dethrone Dungeons and Dragons as the biggest TTRPG? No. No. No, that's not what's going to happen. There are so many people for whom Dungeons and Dragons is the only TTRPG, and if you tell them that there are going to be other games that play functionally identically, they're not going to believe you or care. It's just kind of how it is at the moment. And if it changes, it'll change pretty slowly. Capitalism requires not just profit, it requires growth and profit. Any given company that made a 20% profit margin, which is great for any industry, isn't sitting there and saying, awesome, we made 20%. They're sitting there saying, how do we make 21%? And that's just how the system works. Capitalism also discourages companies that deal with a lot of money from seeing the human. Like, I can speculate that maybe Hasbro didn't fully understand, like, the tricky copyright and trademark issues they were dealing with, but I think it's safe to say they didn't understand tabletop role playing games as a small industry that is heavily based on relationships. You can't just be hostile to the people you're working with and expect to maintain the same relationship you had with them. Um, you can try if you think you have like the coercive power to force them to stay in relationship with you despite treating them poorly. But in this case, they just don't have it. They don't have the copyright or trademark, grip on the product that they seem to think they do. And so, will things change? Yeah. Does it matter? Yeah, I think in this case it does. This is the story of like one of the biggest companies in an industry doing something grossly anti-competitive, and it looks like it might shrink their market share rather than grow it. There's stuff we can learn from that. Like, there are in a lot of areas of our lives where there are companies or politicians or whatever who kind of want to treat us like shit and not think about us as human. And the fact that we are capable of empathy, the fact that we're capable of looking at the specifics of our lives in a way they aren't, gives us opportunities to win sometimes. And that's kind of exciting. Thank you so much to my Patreon supporters, and if you want to see me talk more about tabletop RPGs, watch this video.